Hilchos Kilayim Perek Shlishi, the laws of forbidden mixtures, chapter 3. You have to get used to the regular Sunday morning noise in shul. Put on your agricultural caps today. Okay, put on your farming caps because we're going to be learning about many different types of plants, whether they're forbidden or permitted to be planted with each other. The basic principle of Kilayim is that two different species of plants cannot be planted together as one. However, as we're going to see today, a big player in deciding what's considered a mixture and what's not is if when they grow, the plants are going to look the same, or the fruits are going to look the same. That's going to decide a lot of the time if mixing these two species is Kilayim or not. So the Rambam begins, halacha aleph, yesh minin bazroin. There are certain types of species of plants, sheyiyah hamin ha'echad nifrad letzures harbe. That one species, it's actually all one species, but it'll look in multiple different forms. Because of the different locales and the work which they do to the land. If you work the land differently, it will produce a little bit of a different variation of the same species. To the point that it will look like, when they grow, that it's two separate species. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, even though in appearance they don't look the same, since, agriculturally speaking, we know that they're one category, to mix the two and plant them together is not considered kilayim. It's not considered to be a mixture. On the other hand, you may have plants that are two species that look very similar. The form of them is so close as to almost being considered one form. Nevertheless, since they are two different categories, two different species, they're actually forbidden to be planted with each other. And the Rambam goes through now a pretty long list of different categories of species. Says the Rambam, Ketzad, what does this mean? Ha-chazeres im chazeres galim. So the following couple of halachas contain a number of different names of species. I used the art scroll, Gemara, Maseches Kilayim, followed their system of identification. They based on a number of sources. Primarily the Rambam himself wrote a commentary to the Mishnah where he uses Arabic words to identify each of these species. And using the translations that we now have from Arabic into English, we're able to understand a lot of these things. On the other hand, many of the Rambam's Arabic words are not identifiable today. So we used other commentaries, but I basically, if you want to know the sources for what I'm about to say now, it's all in the art scroll Gemara, Maseches Kilayim. So the Rambam says, ha-chazeres im chazeres galim. Lettuce with what's called in Latin lactuca scariola. This is a sharp, yes, chazeres is chasa, lettuce, standard lettuce. And this is on the right as chazeres galim. It's the type of lettuce that has very sharp edges. I don't know if you can see it. That's why it's called scariola. It's a Latin word. These two, the Rambam is going to say, are not considered kilayim. They look a little different, but they're fundamentally the same species. Then you have what's called chicory and endives. This is chicory, this is ulshin. Again, I'm mostly according to the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah. And this is endives. Look very similar, and they're not going to be considered kilayim with each other. Hakusbarim kusbar harim. Hakreshin im kreshe sada. Leek and wild leek. Wild leek today is called elephant garlic. This plant looks very much like a leek, and they're not kilayim with each other. Hakusbarim kusbar harim. Coriander with mountain coriander. This is not clear what the two types are. Here's just a picture of coriander on the left, and I don't really know what the other type is. The chardal im chardal mitzri, mustard with Egyptian mustard. Again, two very similar. This is mustard seed, classic mustard seed. And with the Egyptian mustard, it's not kilayim. Udlas hamitzris im dlas haremutza. Dlas means squash. Today we have many types of squash, but in the time when the Mishnah was written, they really only had this type. It's called calabash or bottle gourd. This is called dlas. And as the Gemara explains it in the Yerushalmi, there were two types of squash. One squash was naturally sweet. The other squash was called dlas haremutza. Remutza means it had to be dipped in ashes in order to be sweetened. Remetz is hot ash. So dlas hamitzris and dlas haremutza, the Egyptian gourd, with the gourd, the squash that had to be put into ash in order to be sweetened. Einon kilayim zebazeh. They are not, all these mixtures are not considered to be kilayim if you mix the two species, even though some of them look very different, because fundamentally they're one and the same species.
Family.
Yeah. V'chein hachitim im hazunin. Same thing, what's called wheat and darnel. This is wheat growing. This is darnel, a very similar grain. Even the kernels of darnel look very similar to the kernels of wheat. Again, this is the common identification of zunin. Some argue on this, but this is the basic accepted understanding. Barley and oats, similar species. V'hakusmin im hashifain, spelt and rye, that's spelt on the left, rye on the right. V'hapoil im hasapir. Poil, we're going to go with the translation of fava beans. They have a very thick shell. I brought it here once when we went to Hilchos Deis. Very thick green shell, and the beans look like this inside. Sapir, the accepted translation, is cowpeas. So they have a similar shape, just different shades. They're called cowpeas because they have a little like black and white, or black-eyed peas. They're also called, black-eyed peas. The hapurkedon im hatoifach. Purkedon im hatoifach also doesn't have a clear consensus, but many understand that it's the grass pea and vetch. This is right over here. This is purkedon. This is toifach. One translation. Upoil lavan im hasheuim. So here you have a little bit of an argument because here some commentaries say that poil halavan is the cowpea. So what I told you before is the sapir, this one. Some commentaries say that's actually the poil halavan. And the sheuim is this plant here in the middle. This is called an adzuki bean. Huh? Aduki without the Z? It has a Z in it. Many people put it in cholent. It's like a small red bean.
That doesn't look like aduki. Aduki beans is like a Japanese, looks like the one on the left.
No, this is cowpea. This is called the common vetch. Or Vicia stativa in Latin.
It's not mentioned here.
The point is, it's an argument what the shu'it. Today the shu'it is what? In modern Hebrew shu'it is...
is the beans,
it's
the white beans.
No, it's the green beans, no?
No, yes, shu'it yeruka.
Okay, so shu'it yeruka in modern Hebrew is green beans, but in halachic Hebrew, it's some kind of bean. The hakishus im ha-malafafine. So many understand that kishus is a zucchini, and malafafine is a cucumber over here. However, the Rambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah, identifies kishus as what's called the cucumis mellow, a very specific type of, you can see it kind of looks like a cucumber a little bit. It has a lot of pokey things coming out of it. I don't know if you can see in the picture so clearly. But the point is, these are two types. They actually look pretty similar. The hakruv ima troivsar, and cabbage with troivsar. Troivsar, according to one opinion, is cauliflower. According to another opinion, it's kale. Some argue on this because kale wasn't really around so much in Israel in those times. The hatradin im haleoinin. Tradin today in modern Hebrew is translated as spinach, but spinach wasn't around until the Muslims conquered Israel, so that's not what tradin are. Tradin, according to one opinion, is chard. It's this over here. Le'oinin, some understand is sorrel, or what's called arach. Two plants that look pretty similar. Anyway, all of these things, einan kilayim zeim zeh. Some of them look different, some of them look the same. They're fundamentally considered one species, each of these groups, and therefore they're allowed to be planted together. Aval hatsnoin im hanapusin or hanafoisin, but radish with a nafos. Nafos is also a big argument what it is. This is one opinion, the brassica napus, called in Latin. If I'm even pronouncing it right, it's not a turnip, it's a roundish radish family. Okay?
It's a big one.
Now they look the same, pretty much. The hachardalim halafson, and mustard together with this thing on the right, which is called charlock. Looks very similar to mustard. Udlas yavanis, and if you mix a Greek squash in glass mitzris or glass haramutza with the other types of calabash, the bottle gourd, the Egyptian gourd, or the ash gourd, the one that has to be sweetened. Afal pisha daimim zelozeh, even though they look similar, look over here, that's the same thing. These two radishes, the mustard and the charlock, they look very similar. Nevertheless, Kilayim zebozeh, they are considered to be a mixture one with another because they really are two separate species. Halacha daled v'chein be'ilan, also on trees. Sheyesh shnei minin shadaymin zelozeh ba'olin eiba peres. You have two species that are similar to each other in their leaves or in their fruit. Hoyil v'chein shnei minin arelu kilayim. Since there are two types, they're actually kilayim. Ketzad, what does this mean? Hatapuach im achazrar, apples and medlars look pretty similar. Apparently the tree also looks pretty similar. The haparsikin and mashkedim, this is actually interesting. Parsikin and mashkedim are peaches and almonds. Now why are peaches and almonds similar at all? Look at this. The seed of the peach is very similar to the almond shell, and before the almond fully ripens, it's surrounded by this little thing that looks like a peach. The hashizafin im harimin. Shizafin today are called plums, but many understand that this is the shizaf. It's called a jujube. You wouldn't believe there's an actual English word like this. A jujube? Huh? A bean? Really? And this is a plum, because some say it is a plum. And rimin are a subspecies of jujube. I have the Latin name over here. It's called Ziziphus spina something, whatever. Some Latin stuff. The point is, this is a picture of it. This is an actual picture of it. So, shizfin and rimin. Bottom line is, even though both of these categories are very similar to each other, they are going to be considered kilayim, one with the other. But agas, modern Hebrew, is a pear. Krustumelim, some say, is an apricot, type of plum. And quinces with uzrad is commonly understood to be either an azarol or a sorb, the fruit of the service tree. Again, similar. Einon kilayim zebazeh. These groups are considered to be fundamentally the same, and they're not considered kilayim one with the other. Okay, so that pretty much ends the Rambam's basic list, and now the Rambam continues. I gave you one list, but the truth is, every farmer has to check it out. If you have plants or other trees, even if they're by nature two different species, since the leaves of the two plants or trees look the same, or the fruit of each tree looks the same very similarly, till they look like two subcategories of one species. The rabbis here weren't worried if you mix the two plants or the two fruits. The basic principle when it comes to kilayim is that you have to check what it looks like. If it looks the same, not a problem. Looks a little different, problem. Halacha vav, keitzad, what does this look like? Give a practical example of things that look the same and therefore are not kilayim with each other. Halefes imatznoin, turnip and radish. Now I picked over here a radish that looks a little bit like a turnip. They're both white. This is called the elongated radish. But even... Daikon is the proper name? Okay. The Japanese name. But the truth is, it's even true of a redder radish, because on the top, the turnip also has a reddish tinge to it. So lefes with tznoin, einan kilayim zebazeh, they're not considered to be mixtures, forbidden mixture with each other. Mipinesha perei and shavin, because their fruits look very similar. The halefes im hanafus, but going back to the brassica napus, here this is the turnip with the nafus. Einan kilayim zebazeh, they're also not kilayim with each other, because they look the same. Mipinesha ha'alin shalahen shavin, their leaves are similar. But here, back to this one, the radish with the nafus, we said before, even though it seemingly conforms with the similar leaf, similar fruit principle, and should not be kilayim. So here we have to throw in a third variable. They are kilayim with each other. They are forbidden to be planted. Since if you taste them, they taste super different. So it's not clear. The commentators have a bit of a debate. What exactly is the defining factor? It's the look, it's the taste. You got to take both into account. But we're going with the Rambam simple meaning. The same applies to all similar things. Okay, so now we have established a basic list of what's considered mixture, what's not considered mixture. Let's say you have two categories of species that you want to plant them both in your field, but they're considered a mixture. So how far do you have to separate? How much distance do you have to create between two species of plant that would be considered kilayim if they were planted together? Says the Rambam, the way we understand it is, it has to look separate. Separate enough to look separate. But if by looking at them you're going to think, it seems that they're planted as a mix, it's forbidden. Now, because that's the guiding principle, so each species will have a little bit of a different distance. There are many different amounts that were said when it comes to this distance. First of all, you got to take into account how big is the field. If you're making two small patches, it doesn't take much to separate them. But if you have two big fields, you have to make a bigger separation. You also have to take into account leaves. Some plants have huge leaves. They'll grow and totally mix with other plants. Also, you have to take into account how far the roots go. Sometimes roots can go deep down and they'll mix underground, even though on top of the ground they're very far from each other, but the roots go out far. So you have to separate more. And therefore we follow the sages' limitations. Ketzat. What does this look like practically? How do we decide how much distance to give? Says the Rambam, Sadeu shahisazrua min tvua. Let's say you have, it's a pretty primitive picture, but just to give you an idea. Okay? This is wheat, this is barley. So they're both in the category of tvua. Remember yesterday and 2 days ago we saw the list. There's tvua, there's grain, there's kitnias, legumes, and there's zerei negina, garden seeds. So you have two types of grain. Okay, we'll call it wheat. In the same field, you wanted to plant next to it another type of grain. Marchik beinehen beis roiva. Says the Rambam, you have to make a distance between them of what's called the area where you can plant a quarter of a kav. Beis roiva. A square of 10.2 cubits. 10.2 cubits by 10.2 cubits. About 15 feet by 15 feet. Yeah. It's a nice size separation. But the Rambam says this separation doesn't have to run along the length of the entire field. Bein min ha'emtza, bein min hatzad. You can make this square either in the middle, like in this picture. See, just a square in the middle. So even though over here on these two sides, the wheat and the barley will actually be very much close to each other, but as long as in the middle there's a square, it's okay. Or on the side. You put this square on the side of the field. That's how some commentaries understand this line. Others explain this line to mean bein min ha'emtza, whether you put the square in the middle, bein min hatzad, whether you do have it run all along the length of the field. But the point is, either way you do it, as long as there's minimum separation of 10.2 by 10.2, it's allowed.
But what about the rest of the field?
It's okay. As long as you've made a
almost touching each other?
Yes, exactly. As long as you have this space in the middle, even if over here and over here they're touching each other, it's okay.
Well, what's the point?
The point is nikar. It has to be recognizable that it's separate.
Oh, for
people looking. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
If you did not make this big of a distance between the two fields, usher, now it's forbidden to plant this way. To get lashes biblically, they have to be 6 handbreadths, but 1.5 feet close to each other. That's, if you have no separation and you bring them close to 1.5 feet, then you'll get lashes. Any more than that, we're not going to hold you accountable for lashes.
But maybe there are two owners, and maybe one doesn't agree with the other. How big they make the...
Two owners, we're going to see in a second, is a different law. This is one owner. One owner. By the way, some commentaries say that there's no excuse for just having this. You can have something like this, where there's a square in the middle, and then diagonally it goes off to the sides. But at no point can the wheat and the barley be touching directly like this. It has to be like this. Here, since the 2 points are touching diagonally, we're going to see later at the end of the chapter, there's a principle that's called Reish Tor. Reish Tor means if one field is entering another at an angle, it's not considered to be mixed. So over here, as long as you have a space in the middle empty, and then it tapers off to the sides on a diagonal, that's what's allowed. But the common understanding of the Rambam is like this. As long as you have a square in the middle, it's totally fine if they're touching on the other sides. This is all for grains. Halacha Yud, Hoisa Sadeu Zrua Yarak, Ubikesh Lizreya Betzidas, the Yarak Acher. If you had a field of vegetables and you wanted to plant next to it another field of another type of vegetable, Afilu Dlas, even if it's a squash, whose leaves are very big, Marchik Bein Shtei Asadois, Shisha Tvachim, Al Shisha Tvachim Meruba. Same concept, except the space doesn't have to be so big. You don't have to have 10.2 amas. All you can have is 6 Tvachim by 6 Tvachim square. Bein min atzad, bein min ha'emtza. Again, whether it's on the side of the field, whether it's in the middle, or as other commentators explain it, whether it runs all along the side, or it's only in one area, that's fine. Upaches mishir zeh aser. Less than this amount will be forbidden. But no lashes till it's mamish a handbreadth close to each other. Halacha Yud Aleph, Hoisa achas mishtei asades zrua tvua. If on the one side you have grain, and on the other side you want to put vegetables. So again, 2 grains need a 10.2 by 10.2. 2 vegetables need 6 handbreadths by 6 handbreadths. If you have grain and vegetables, you need to go with a higher amount. Marchik b'nei and beis roiva. You have to have the full 10.2 by 10.2 square separating them. Says the Rambam Halacha Yud Beis, a general caveat. When do we say that you have to have all these distances with these amounts. Beis reiva, shisha tfachim, bein shtei sades. It's only if it's 2 fields, 2 significant size fields. Avalim hoisa sadeu zrua yarak. But if your field was a full vegetable field, v'ratza lizreya betzida shura shel yarak miminacher, and all you wanted to make was another line, another row, not another field, another row of vegetables. All you have to do is dig a little furrow between the field and this row.
Yeah, it makes sense because the roots of each other will never reach
Exactly. The other one. Yeah. Orkei shisha tfachim bilvad, with a length of just 6 tfachim, 6 handbreadths, v'rachboi ka'amkai, and its width like its depth, which the commentators claim is 1 tefach. In other words, instead of having a square of 6 by 6 tfachim, you have to have 6 tfachim length. Yes, the length has to be the same, but the width could be much smaller, just 1 handbreadth. Halacha yud gimel hoisa sadeu zrua tvua v'rdatza lizreya b'seicha shura shel yarak. You have a wheat field or a grain field, and in the grain field you want to plant 1 row of vegetable. Afilu shura shel dluin she'olin shelahen aruchim u'mistabchim. Even if you want to plant squash, which is going to have again long and intermingling leaves. Marchik b'nei and shisha tfachim, all that's required is a distance of 6 tfachim. If indeed the squash leaves start growing into the grain and intermingling with it, just pick out some more of the grain in front of the squash till there's no more mixture. The commentaries say that really you could also cut down the squash, but apparently squash was more expensive. So the Rambam is giving what's called Eitzah Tova. He's giving you good advice. The good advice is cut out more of the wheat, which is less expensive, and let the squash keep growing. Needless to say, if it's only 2 rows, not a field in a row, it's just a row of one type and a row of another type, all that's required is 1 furrow, 1 small furrow, 6 tefachim length, 1 tefach width, as will be explained. Let's say you were a big tzaddik. You did right. You had 2 fields, and you made the proper distance between the 2. And then they grew, and they grew. And all of a sudden they're reaching each other over ground. Whether it's a grain over a grain, vegetable over a vegetable, or vegetable over grain, grain over vegetable, hakol muter. It's all permitted. Can't hold you accountable. You did the distance right. Hashem made the things grow bigger. That's fine. With the exception of the Greek squash. That goes very far, apparently. So therefore, if that one begins to tilt, then you have to uproot the other type from in front of it as it grows, as we explained. If between the 2 types of species there was an unplowed field or a plowed field, just empty space, or a type of fence, or an open pathway, or a fence that was 10 tfachim tall, like in this picture here, or a ditch that was 10 tfachim deep and 4 tfachim wide, or a tree whose leaves are going all the way over till it's making shade over the ground, or a rock that's 10 tfachim tall and 4 tfachim wide. Here you have a clear fence. You can literally bring the wheat all the way up to the fence, and on the other side, this is a grapevine all the way up to the fence. No problem. Since one of these structures, a rock, a fence, whatever type of thing it is dividing between the 2 rows, that's considered to be acceptable, that it's seen separate from each other. Halacha Tazayim, another general exception to this rule. When do we say you have to have a distance or a separating entity? Only if you're planting in your field. But if your field was planted with wheat, your friend, the next door neighbor, can plant in his field right next to you barley. Because look at the verse. What does the verse say? Sodcha lo yisizra kilayim. Your field, you cannot plant with a mixture. The prohibition is only that you plant your field with mixtures. Shalei nemar ha'aretz le'tizara kilayim. Doesn't say in the Torah that the earth cannot be planted with mixtures. That's not a problem. The problem is for you in your field to plant kilayim. Not only that, watch this. You can have a mixture in your own field. You have a wheat field. Next to the wheat field, right next to it, you have a barley field. But your neighbor also has a barley field. You pulled your barley till your friend's barley, which he's allowed to plant barley because he can do a mix with you. But now your barley also gets little bonus points because it's going to attach itself to the friend's barley. It's permitted. Because anybody that's looking from outside can think your barley is probably the end of your neighbor's barley. So they're not going to think that you did kilayim. If both you and your friend have a wheat field, you can plant one row of flaxseed next to your wheat field between yours and your neighbor's. Not so much for separation. Rather, anybody looking knows nobody plants one row of flaxseed. If you plant flaxseed, you plant a lot. So if you planted only one row, the person who planted it was simply doing a test. He was trying to see if his earth is fertile enough to grow flaxseed. And it seems like, or it looks like, he's basically planting for destruction. He's not intending for it to last. And therefore it's not kilayim. Therefore, anything else besides for flaxseed, you can't plant one row between these two fields of same grain. Till you distance into your own possession, stop the wheat a little earlier, and then plant the other type. If your field and your friend's field had two types of grain, yours was wheat, his was barley. You cannot plant between the two fields mustard seed or charia safflower, even one row. Because people do plant one row of such things, and it looks like kilayim. But if the two fields were two different types of, not grains, but vegetables, you could plant between them mustard seed or safflower. Because mustard seed or safflower can be surrounding any other species except for grain, because they don't have a harmful effect on grain, so it looks like kilayim. Other things, they could damage them. Therefore, it's okay if you put them next to each other. Here's the rule what I told you before. That's called reish toir. If one field enters at a corner, hitting the side of another field, maybe a little more accurately would actually be to put this edge at the end of the field. This is the better reish toir. Here we go. You have the corner of one field is touching the side of another field in the same field. In other words, it's all yours, but they're touching at an angle. That's allowed because they look separate. Needless to say, if it was corner to corner, not corner to side, that's for sure separate. It looks like two separate fields. The edge of one field touches the edge of another field. In which case it's permitted with no distance, no separation, as we explained, because two separate fields never have the worry of being a forbidden mixture.
Yeah, but